answer was purposely misleading, and I think others do too.
You lied to Congress.
The American public has seen quite well that you are biased in this situation and you've not been objective.
I think history will judge you harshly.
Today, Barr, over and over, almost like a defense attorney for the president, doing just that, defending Donald Trump and dodging questions about the interactions between Bill Barr and the president himself.
Has the president or anyone at the White House ever asked or suggested that you open an investigation of anyone? Yes or no, please, sir?
The president or anybody else?
Seems you would remember something like that and be able to tell us.
Yeah, but I'm trying to grapple with the word suggest. I mean, there have been discussions of matters out there that they have not asked me to open an investigation, but
Perhaps they've suggested?
I don't know. I wouldn't say suggest.
Hinted?
I don't know.
Inferred? You don't know. Okay.
Barr also hitting Bob Mueller, for declining to make a decision on obstruction.
I think that if he felt that he shouldn't go down the path of making a traditional prosecutive decision, then he shouldn't have investigated. That was the time to pull up.
But Mueller was very clear in his report. He did not make a finding on obstruction because he thought it should be up to Congress to do just that. Barr today repeating over and over he did not think that was Mueller's choice to make.
Bob Mueller is the equivalent of a U.S. attorney. He's part of the Department of Justice. His work concluded when he sent his report to the Attorney General. At that point, it was my baby. And it was my decision how and when to make it public, not Bob Mueller's.
Joining us now, New Jersey, my home state senator and presidential candidate, Cory Booker, who questioned Attorney General Bill Barr today. Senator, I want to start by playing part of your questions earlier.
I fear that you are adding normalcy to a point where we should be sounding alarms as opposed to saying that there's nothing to see here. You seem to be excusing a campaign that literally had hundreds of contacts with a foreign adversary. Your conduct seems to be trying to normalize that behavior.
Senator, you clearly say that Bill Barr at this point should resign. But given that you are in the minority, what can you do about it?
Well, I mean, come on. At this point, it's kind of absurd. He showed a level of cowardice today. As opposed to standing behind the plate like an umpire, calling balls and strikes, he was over there hiding in the dugout of Team Trump and representing a president as opposed to doing his job as an independent attorney general. It's inexcusable. Anybody who reads that point just wants to be objective. It's a report that describes deceit, lies, instructing people to falsify documents. There is so much outrageous behavior in that document that is creating a normalcy in our country of behavior that in any other time period before this would have had both sides crying foul and, in fact, showing that you're endangering this nation. Just think about this. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Without a doubt, but this is 2019, and Barr's performance today surely pleased the president, and you saw Lindsey Graham and an entire squad of human shields defending the president and Bill Barr. So you and I might think it's absurd, and historically it would have been absurd, but we're living in the present. So what is the reality in terms of consequences? Bill Barr's not even going to show up tomorrow.
Well, again, the consequences, I still am a believer that you speak truth to power. I'm still a believer that you call it like it is. And we have an obligation, I don't care if you're a Democrat or Republican, to call this out for what it is. The way that Barr described this report so angered even Mueller, that Mueller did something that was unusual, to put in writing his calling into question the role that Barr was playing and how he was misleading the American public to believe that there weren't objectionable things in that report that are tantamount to obstruction. And so this is more my concern right now, is that this Mueller report now is almost like a playbook telling the Chinese or the Russians and future campaigns that want to put their own ambition in front of their patriotism in this country about how to try to subvert our elections. Because this campaign, and I've heard people on both sides of the aisle, even if foreign operatives and foreign adversaries reach out to a campaign campaign. Everybody down here in Washington knows what you're supposed to do, which is call the FBI. Here is a campaign that delighted in them being reached out to, that called upon foreign adversaries to break the law, and that did things to collude with them in order to win an election. And then on top of that, then you have a presidency that literally engaged in deep levels of deceit and deep levels of trying to obstruct an investigation, from threatening to fire people, trying to change public documents, and ultimately lie continuously to the American public. That's not my description. That's the facts that were presented in this Mueller report. And for us not to say, time out for a second, let's call this like it is, to me is unforgivable. And that's why I've called upon Barr to resign. Because remember, there's ongoing investigations that he now gets to oversee. There's more than a dozen ongoing investigations and information that Mueller found in the course of this investigation that didn't directly relate to him, but indications of potential criminal activity, that now Barr is expected to be an objective, independent attorney general and overseeing those investigations. I really think not. He has burned through any credibility he had in that role, and he should resign.
So what does that mean for all of those ancillary investigations? Seeing that Barr is the attorney general, are they all tainted now?
Well, it casts a serious shadow, but I have a lot of faith in some of the leadership in places like the Southern District of New York. I have a lot of faith in those people to continue those investigations. And I think now Barr, should he stay in that job, and I think he should resign, should he stay in that job, he needs to know that he's going to have the fierce eye of history on him, and he's going to be held accountable for anything he does in protecting a president whose behavior has been described by Mueller as at least strong evidence, 10 different counts of potential obstruction. And again, things that he did in the campaign that even in the American context would be viewed as illegal. Remember, sharing polling information with an American super PAC is against the law, and they shared polling information with a foreign adversary in order to advantage their campaign.
Think about the irony. We look at the report, and what's the takeaway? That we didn't put America first, one of the president's favorite slogans. Tell me about Republicans, your colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and I don't mean those who we necessarily heard from today, who you've worked with time and again. Are they saying something else behind the scenes? Because most rational people think, at least those who read all 400-plus pages, that those 400-plus pages are not reflected in the 4-page summary. Are Republicans behind the scenes? Are you seeing any cracks that they're seeing that?
Listen, I have real friendships across the aisle that I'm very proud of that helped me get a lot of legislation passed. And I've been hearing about condemnations of this president's moral vandalism in private, from his failure to condemn Nazis, putting children in cages, refusing to accept a bipartisan Senate, a unanimous vote to keep the government open and instead shut it down.
But I mean in terms of this. This is where the rubber hits the road.
Well, no, I actually think the rubber hit the road a long time ago. I think this president has been engaged in the undermining of our democratic institutions and our democratic norms in a way that should have called more and more people to speak publicly about what they say in private. And this clearly is a case, because if this doesn't account for obstruction, where the Attorney General would bring these charges, then just think about what's going on in this Mueller report that the next president now believes that they can do, ordering their White House counsel to manufacture documents, ordering the firing people for the sole purpose of stopping an investigation. This Attorney General is now saying that's okay. That's now the norm. That's all right. Not to mention a campaign that was literally calling for the violation of American laws by a foreign adversary. We can't normalize this. All of us have an obligation to say what's in this report is wrong. And for him to characterize this report with saying that the American public should be grateful, was the words he used, that somehow we should be grateful that there was no so-called collusion, which is not a legal term. To me, this is really a low in terms of the erosion of our democratic norms, and unfortunately, a roadmap for anybody watching for the future that could continue this descent into the undermining of the principles of our democracy.
What do you think Bob Mueller is going to do? It's truly out of character for him to write a letter like that, for the press to get that letter. He's a true chain of command kind of guy. We heard from Lindsey Graham today, who we have to note in the past has called the president unfit, a disaster, a kook. Now Lindsey Graham defending the president president and Bill Barr over and over. At the end of the day, he said he doesn't even think they need to call Robert Mueller to testify. Do you think Bob Mueller is going to insist upon it?
Well, again, I think Lindsey, who I've worked with on legislation, criminal justice reform, for example, I think he's wrong in this case. I think clearly anybody who reads this report, for all that the resources we put into it, should think at the very least the author of the report, who understands all the underlying documentation, should come forward and answer the questions of the body that now has the obligation to hold the president accountable and provide oversight. So it would be a serious mistake, again, that history will not look kindly on. And I know that the House of Representatives will be calling Mueller to testify, as I am calling for the Judiciary Committee to do as well.
Senator, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Senator Cory Booker from the state of New Jersey. All right, I want to bring in Nick Confessori, political reporter for the New York Times, and former U.S. Attorney Joyce Vance, who has been working overtime today. Joyce, you have spent hours in this chair. Now that you have watched it, you've thought about it, you've observed, you've absorbed, what is your takeaway?
You know, I think it was a disappointing performance. It was a bad day for the Justice Department because we saw an Attorney General who perhaps did not commit outright perjury, but who was willing to slice things very narrowly, cut his responses close to the bone in order to support this president. And as I think you pointed out in opening, by the end of the day, you had the feeling that you had been listening to the president's defense team, not the Attorney General of the United States.
Then, Nick, what comes next? If Barr refuses to testify tomorrow, where do we go from here? This is a massively important issue for those in Washington. It's a massively important issue for those of us covering it. But when you go out on the trail, right, Elizabeth Warren just said it at a recent town hall, she and Beto O'Rourke, of the 75 questions they were asked, only 2 were about this. It's important for our democracy, for rule of law, but it doesn't seem to be a priority yet for the American people. So what happens tomorrow?
The problem we are at now is that we are now talking about the process of the investigation, and the substance of it is receding, which is good for Trump and good for his team and good for his campaign. That's why they're slow rolling everything. You can see in the approach of Bob Barr the overall strategy, which is to interpret questions as narrowly as possible, to answer them with the fewest amount of facts, to talk about the process of the investigation, but not the underlying instances of wrongdoing and bad behavior that Mueller had documented. And that's going to push all of this, unfortunately, into a partisan dogfight. It's going to be a talk about he said and she said. It's very hard to keep the public focused on the underlying things revealed. And you were talking there in very lofty terms about democratic ideals and accountability. I think a lot of that is dead. This is a power struggle, pure and simple. And if Bob Barr had a mission and it was a movie, it would be Saving Private Donald. That's what he's doing.
But it's unfortunate because at the end of the day, we should put decency, civility, and the rule of law first. I want to play Bill Barr specifically being pressed on incidents of potential obstruction of justice. Take a look.
The report found that Michael Cohen's testimony to the House before it, that the president repeatedly implied that Cohen's family members had committed crimes. Do you consider that evidence to be an attempt to convince a witness to change testimony?
No.
The report found that after Manafort was convicted, the president himself called him a brave man for refusing to break.
Yes. And that is not obstruction.
Joyce, what's your reaction? Eric Holder said on Twitter, Donald Trump would absolutely be charged with obstruction had it not been for a flawed restriction against indicting a sitting president.
So I think virtually every experienced federal prosecutor who's looked at the evidence in the Mueller report has concluded just that but for the prohibition on indicting a president, Donald Trump would now formally be defendant Donald Trump. But leaving that aside for a moment, what's distressing about Barr's testimony here is it's as though he's saying, You know, the only barrier, the only bar that a president has to clear is criminality. And as long as the president's conduct isn't an outright criminal violation, then no harm, no foul. I think we're entitled to expect more of a president.
But then did Robert Mueller almost set Congress up to fail? If he went all the way up to the line, but said, it's not my call to make, I hand it to you, Congress. And Congress, listen, we just talked to Cory Booker, would sure like to get something done, but they don't have the ability to, then what?
Look, I think Robert Mueller is operating in a world in which institutions have power and guard their own prerogatives, and that the House as a whole would take this up in a nonpartisan way. I'm not sure that's true anymore. He clearly wrote a roadmap to impeachment proceedings in his report. It is an open invitation to look at the evidence and say, if you think this is obstruction, it's up to you. It was always going to be about that. I think what was fascinating.
And he can't help it if the system is now warped.
That's correct. And, I was fascinated to watch Bob Barr try and have it both ways, right? He says, look, kind of once he handed off the report, it was my baby.
My baby.
But in the same turn, he's attacking Mueller for not coming to a decision. It's obvious what he wanted was for Mueller to take this decision off of his hands and let the president off the hook so he wouldn't have to.
Last point, Joyce.
I think that's absolutely right, Nick. This was a binary choice, and the choice was Mueller was supposed to clear the president or Mueller was supposed to clear the president. He didn't do that, so Bill Barr had to.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.